Greetings and welcome to Converging Streams, Interfaith Fellowship in Our Modern World. Our program is a production of the Muncie Interfaith Fellowship and the Unitarian Universalist Church of Muncie. This installment, Delayed Gratification in an Instant Gratification World, contains a portion of a panel talk at the 2012 Conference on World Affairs in Boulder, Colorado, and a musical interlude recorded at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Muncie, Indiana. Please welcome Reverend George Wolfe.
I wonder how many of you know of the name Jacob Bronowski? A few. Okay. Well, Jacob Bronowski was a cultural anthropologist who wrote a book and had a PBS series on television entitled The Ascent of Man. It's a wonderful exposition. It's interesting because it's not, Darwin wrote the book The Descent of Man. This is The Ascent of Man, but it's all about technological and discoveries, how it lifted us, it built a scaffolding to lift humanity up to higher and higher levels of economic well-being, social well-being, and so forth. In that book, in the beginning, he says that an important step in the evolution of the human species and early, our ancestors before Homo sapiens were here, somewhere came the ability to forego a desire for a long-term goal. And he says that was an important step, he feels, in the evolution of the species, of the human species. But that's an example of how, if you approach it from science, you can see that our whole infrastructure, the scaffolding on which we are resting right now, culturally and educationally and everything else, has been built on people who have a delayed gratification and forego long-term goals. Now, this idea, of course, is present in religious traditions as well. In the Upanishads, which is a Hindu scripture that deals with spiritual enlightenment, it says that the wise, knowing the soul to be eternal, seek not the things that pass away. The wise, knowing the soul to be eternal, seek not the things that pass away. It's kind of similar to what you have in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. So the idea of the temporal, the short-term sensual gratification is something which doesn't result in long-term fulfillment, and that we need to structure our lives so that we gain those long-term goals. And, we call that discipline. In higher education, we'd call that discipline. So if you're a student here, and I've had the experience when I was a student, you have a test tomorrow, you're in your dorm room studying, and your friends come by and say, hey, man, there's a great band playing downtown. And a bunch of us guys are going down and going to have a few beers. It'll be a great time. Come on. And you say, well, no, I got to study. I got to stay for this test. Come on. It won't matter. You'll do okay. But if you say no to that, then you're pursuing a long-term goal. Yes. If you say yes, well, then you'll hear a great musician. But you have to catch it some other time. Anyways. All I know is as a classical saxophonist, I spent a lot of hours, those 1.5, 2 hours a day I spent in the practice room when I was in high school and college and at the School of Music at Indiana University. They've paid off tremendously in my life and giving me a kind of fulfilling career, and without that, it wouldn't have happened. Now, how many of you have heard of Henry David Thoreau? All right, that's better. Well, he comes at this a little different way. He talks about simplicity. We need to simplify our lives because so many of us are slaves to our material possessions and our short-term needs. And so the purpose of simplifying one's life is so that you have more time to think more deeply, to contemplate the deeper meaning of life, to get in touch with the inner life, which we might call the spiritual side of ourselves. And thus develop within as much as without. He said something about, someone asked him about traveling, and he says, He doesn't believe in traveling much, although he did travel out of New England. He went to Minnesota and he went to Maine and things like that, and Cape Cod, because he wrote a book on those subjects. But he says that we should first explore the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans of our own mind. And he saw this, infinite potential within us to delve deeply into reality, into life. And that's what we really need to do first. Well, I've always taught in a public university. I never had a chance to teach in a church-affiliated school, and although I wanted that, but my path just winded me up in public universities. And when the concept of secular humanism came out, I was excited about it because that would enable me, although I'm a believer, that would enable me to pursue the teaching of morals and character and so forth in a context which was acceptable in a secular, non-church affiliated institution. And but what seems to have happened is that recently there's been some studies come out which shows that this current generation is scoring lower on empathy, on tests, on instruments which measure empathy. And that there's a concern about the fact that this concept, that this me generation, so to speak, that there's a valid reason to call it that, because there's a tendency for students to be more self-centered. Again, that implies that they see their own selfish immediate needs as more important than the greater good and so forth. So what I'm concerned about is that perhaps secular humanism has failed, that it has not created a generation of humanists, but rather it has created a generation of secular materialists. And I think we need to think about that, and because I think secular materialism is not good. Secular humanism is good, and especially in a context, especially for people who don't have affinity for religious traditions. But we need to be, I think, concerned about that.
Thank you to all three of our panelists for some great views about delayed versus instant gratification. And I want to ask you all about this concept of gratitude versus gratification, because we need to delay gratification, but we're also told to live in the present. George, let's have you do that. George Wolfe.
Well, I really appreciate your comments, Jeff, because what you're describing, and I don't know if this is going to address your question, but maybe I'll get around to it. What you're describing, I think, would be called in the context of meditation and spirituality, witnessing or mindfulness, and meditative, and that really well, and meditative practices develop that. They develop the ability to center oneself within the present moment. And one could say there's two types of, I always say there's two kinds of mindfulness. There's voluntary mindfulness, which means that I'm constructing or contriving it in my own mind. In other words, I'm saying I'm going to watch myself pick up this glass of water, and now I'm going to drink. So I'm watching myself do it. That's voluntary. I'm bringing it. I'm conjuring it up by virtue of my own mental state. And then there's what's called involuntary mindfulness. And involuntary mindfulness is when it happens extemporaneously by itself. And that's really what meditation develops. Meditation develops the ability to have involuntary mindfulness, where you're just walking down the street, you're doing something during the day, and all of a sudden you find yourself witnessing. You find yourself being mindful. And when you're in that state, you're grounded. You're grounded in an inner contentment. And that inner contentment is what it stabilizes you, so that you don't have to grab that marshmallow, or that you can witness it and make an assessment about it before you decide to grab the marshmallow or not. So when that is where, first of all, and it's important to point out that is not a repression of desire. That state of inner contentment does not result from repressing desires. This is a misinterpretation a lot of people have of Buddhist practice, that we should somehow stop desiring. Rather, that state of inner contentment is such that desires it's on a deep enough level that desires just don't arise. It's sort of like, I use the analogy, if you're sitting in the sunlight, you don't find yourself desiring a candle, right? I mean, and you don't have to not desire. You don't have to say, no, I'm not going to desire a candle. I'm not going to desire. No, it just doesn't come up because the sunlight is so full, and that's that the deep inner contentment or fullness of spirituality one gets from long-term meditative practice.
Thank you for listening to Converging Streams, Interfaith Fellowship in Our Modern World. Our program is a production of the Muncie Interfaith Fellowship, with content and financial support from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Muncie and technical support from radio stations WCRD and Work FM. Most importantly, we thank you, our listeners and followers, for your support. To connect with Converging Streams, including listening to our entire catalog of past programs, getting our latest new content, and making your own contribution to this program, visit our website, convergingstreams.org. Converging Streams is produced by Tony Piazza, George Wolfe, and Thomas Perchlik. Thank you for listening and have a pleasant week.